If you ask people to imagine a Viking, the image that usually pops up is a tall, muscle-bound warrior, stomping across some muddy field, a horned helmet gleaming in the mist, swinging a giant axe that looks like it could chop down a redwood in one blow. They're shouting, they're raiding, they're basically the rock stars of the early Middle Ages. It's history's heavy metal poster, and yet none of it is quite right. The truth is, we are addicted to Viking myths. They're cinematic, they're brutal, they're exciting. They make us feel like history was one big action movie starring bearded Scandinavians with incredible hair care routines. But real Vikings were, well, human, messy, complicated, pragmatic, sometimes cruel, sometimes surprisingly relatable. And that's what makes the truth so much more interesting than the fiction. Because once we strip away the cliques, the real Viking world looks like something that would confuse you, surprise you, and occasionally make you laugh out loud. Why do we love the myths so much? Probably because they're simple. A horned helmet is easier to remember than the fact that actual Viking headgear, more like your uncle's old iron pot, savage barbarian raiders, is easier to grasp than farmers who sometimes raided because they needed silver to buy grain when harvests failed. And the story of a crazed berserker charging into battle on magic mushrooms is more fun than a trained warrior who used intimidation and tactics. But here is the thing, the reality doesn't ruin the story, it makes it richer. Vikings were not superheroes, but they also weren't faceless brutes. They were innovators, traders, explorers, poets, lawmakers, and yes, occasionally terrifying raiders. They shaped the DNA of Europe and left behind myths so sticky that we're still telling them 1,000 years later. So, in this episode, we're going to pull apart the greatest Viking myths one by one. We'll look at where they came from, how they got so popular, and what the evidence really says. Along the way, expect some ironic detours, a few wait, what moments, and maybe a newfound respect for just how complicated history can be. Ready? Let's raid the myths. Not once, not in a single archaeological dig, have we found a Viking helmet with horns attached. What we have found are simple iron helmets, sometimes with a nose guard, sometimes with a little face mask, but always practical. Why? Because if you've ever tried to fight while wearing decorative horns, you know exactly why. They're heavy, they get caught in branches, and worst of all, they make you a very convenient target. Imagine a Viking charging at you with foot-long antlers attached to his skull. Where are you going to aim your spear? Exactly. So where did the horned helmet myth come from? Strangely enough, it wasn't the Vikings who invented it, it was the Victorians. In the 19th century, Europe was obsessed with the noble savage idea, and opera was the Marvel cinematic universe of its day. Enter Richard Wagner and his operatic epic Der Ring des Nibelungen. Wagner's costume designers, needing something dramatic, slapped horns on their Viking-inspired characters, and boom, the image stuck. From there, painters, illustrators, and later Hollywood directors spread it until it became gospel truth in pop culture. Now, to be fair, horned helmets did exist, but centuries before the Vikings, and in completely different contexts. Bronze Age ceremonial helmets with curved decorations have been found in Northern Europe. They were for rituals, not raiding. Think fancy parade outfit, not storming a monastery. So the horned helmet has a sort of long-lost cousin in history, but it never belonged to the Vikings themselves. What did the Vikings really look like in battle? Picture something less theatrical, more efficient. A round wooden shield, an iron helmet shaped like an upside-down bowl. Maybe a chainmail shirt, if you were wealthy. The average Viking wasn't trying to win a fashion contest, he was trying not to die. And yet, because of one German opera and a few to many illustrations, we now imagine them as extras from a fantasy film. It's ironic, really. The horned helmet is fake, but it's probably the most recognizable piece of Viking culture today, which just goes to show, once a myth takes root, it doesn't need evidence, it just needs good marketing. And Vikings, ironically, have been marketed better than almost any other people in history. Now, let's tackle another classic myth, that Vikings were nothing but bloodthirsty raiders, storming into villages with no other purpose than burning, pillaging, and causing maximum chaos. This image comes mostly from medieval monks, who, let's face it, were often on the receiving end of those raids. If you're writing a chronicle, and your monastery just got robbed of its gold candlesticks, you're probably not going to describe the attackers as skilled maritime traders with a flexible economy. You're going to call them spawn of Satan. The truth, however, is that Vikings were as much merchants as they were raiders. In fact, for most of them, trade was far more important than war. Archaeological evidence shows Viking settlements buzzing with commercial life. Silver coins from the Islamic world, silk from Byzantium, glass beads from the Frankish kingdoms. The Vikings were plugged into a global economy centuries before globalization was cool. So why did they raid? Simple economics. Raiding was high risk, but also high reward. If you're a young man in 9th century Norway, you've got limited farmland. You don't inherit much land from your father, and you need wealth to start a family well. You've got two choices. You can sit around hoping for a good harvest, or you can join a crew, sail across the sea, and come back with treasure and stories. It's basically the medieval version of a startup gamble. Some failed, some got rich, and some ended up with their names carved into sagas. It's also worth noting that raiding wasn't constant. For every dramatic attack recorded in a chronicle, there were years of peaceful trading voyages. Towns like Hidibi and Birka were essentially Viking shopping malls, thriving on commerce, and often, raiding and trading were two sides of the same coin. A Viking crew might raid one monastery and then sail a few miles further to sell the stolen goods in a perfectly civilized marketplace. Moral flexibility at its finest. Another point, Vikings weren't uniquely savage compared to their neighbors. Everyone in the early Middle Ages was raiding everyone else. Irish monks raided rival monasteries. English kings raided each other's villages. The Franks spent centuries butchering one another in civil wars. The Vikings were just better at it, because they had ships that could cross oceans and slip up rivers. Imagine if your local gang had access to both pickup trucks and stealth submarines. That's how much of an advantage longships gave them. So, were Vikings bloodthirsty savages? Sometimes, yes. They could be ruthless, brutal, and terrifying. But most of the time, they were farmers, craftsmen, and traders trying to make a living. The myth of the Viking as a non-stop marauder is like describing modern business people only by the times they commit insider trading. It's not untrue, but it's hardly the full picture. One of the most beloved Viking myths is that they discovered America long before Columbus. And here is the thing, this one is actually true. Sort of. The details just need some careful unpacking. The Norse sagas, written down centuries after the Viking Age, tell the story of Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red. Around the year 1000, he supposedly sailed west from Greenland and found a mysterious land he called Vinland. According to the sagas, Vinland was a place of wild grapes, fertile soil, and tall timber. Sounds a lot like a medieval travel brochure. For a long time, historians argued about whether this was a legend or reality. Then came the smoking gun, Lanso Meadows, a site at the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada. Discovered in the 1960s, it revealed clear evidence of a Viking settlement: iron nails, turf houses, and the remains of a forge. Later studies even pushed the dating to around the year 1021, which means Vikings definitely set foot in North America 5 centuries before Columbus ever dreamed of sailing west. So, case closed. Well, not quite. The Vikings didn't exactly discover America. Native peoples had been living there for thousands of years. When the Norse arrived, they met the locals, whom the sagas call Skrulings. And those encounters, let's just say they weren't friendly. According to the stories, the Norse traded a little, fought a lot, and eventually realized they were badly outnumbered. Unlike Europe, where monasteries made for easy targets, North America came with communities ready to fight back. Another reality check: the settlement at Lanceau Meadows wasn't permanent. The Vikings never colonized America, never built towns there, never left a lasting footprint. It seems like Vinland was more of a seasonal base, a place to harvest timber and explore than a new world empire. After a few decades, they abandoned it. The dream of a Viking America faded, leaving only stories. Still, the fact remains, they were the first Europeans to cross the Atlantic. That's impressive. Imagine sailing 2,000 miles in a wooden ship with no GPS, no weather forecast, just a sun compass and a lot of guts. It's one of those cases where the myth is mostly true, but the reality, as always, is messier. So next time someone tells you the Vikings discovered America, you can nod and say, yes, but they didn't exactly stick around. History is never as simple as the bumper sticker version. Here is a myth that refuses to die: that Vikings were filthy, smelly, unkempt barbarians. You can almost smell the stereotype: sweaty warriors, reeking of ale and blood, too busy raiding to bother with a bath. But reality: Vikings were some of the cleanest people in medieval Europe. Let's start with archaeology. Viking combs are everywhere. Excavations in York, Dublin, and Scandinavia have unearthed hundreds of them, carved from bone and antler. Toothpicks, ear spoons, tweezers, yes, tweezers have also been found. Imagine a Viking carefully plucking his eyebrows before heading out to raid your village. It sounds absurd, but grooming mattered. Contemporary sources back this up. The Anglo-Saxon chroniclers, who had every reason to paint Vikings as monsters, admitted grudgingly that they were annoyingly well-groomed. One account complains that Viking men bathed every Saturday, combed their hair, and wore clean clothes, which apparently made them irresistible to English women. Picture a grumpy monk shaking his fist and saying, "Curse those handsome, shampooed Scandinavians stealing our ladies." Bathing was part of the culture. The Old Norse word lugadaga, bath day, and it gave us the modern word Saturday. In Scandinavia, hot springs were used like spas, and in towns, bathhouses were common. Viking cleanliness wasn't just about vanity, it was also practical. A clean body helped prevent lice and disease, which was a real advantage in crowded settlements or on long voyages. So where did the dirty barbarian myth come from? Mostly propaganda. Medieval writers wanted to portray the Vikings as uncivilized beasts, the opposite of Christian society. Dirt and savagery made for easy shorthand. Later, romantic writers of the 19th century doubled down, preferring to imagine rugged warriors caked in mud rather than men with neatly trimmed beards and perfumed hair oil. The truth is that Vikings probably smelled like any farmers or sailors of the time, sweaty after work, sure, but not the unwashed savages of legend. They cared about appearance. They braided their hair, they wore jewelry, they even dyed their clothes. If you think of them as wild, dirty cavemen, you're missing the point. These were people who could strike terror with an axe in the morning and still charm at a feast in the evening. So yes, Vikings fought, farmed, and occasionally smelled like fish after a long voyage. But filthy, No, in fact, by medieval standards, they were basically hygiene influencers. Another myth paints Viking women, background characters, quiet housekeepers, while the men did all the interesting stuff. But this couldn't be further from the truth. In many ways, Viking women had more rights and independence than women in most of Europe at the time. First, let's talk about marriage and property. Viking women could inherit land, manage farms, and even divorce their husbands. A woman who divorced could reclaim her dowry and walk away. In a world where most women were legally considered their husband's property, that's pretty remarkable. The sagas are full of sharp-tongued women who managed households, arranged alliances, and weren't afraid to shame their men into action if they thought they were being cowardly. Women also ran the show when men were away. While their husbands were off trading or raiding, wives kept the farm alive, managed the workforce, and handled legal disputes. They weren't passive, they were CEOs of the homestead. Without them, Viking society would have collapsed. But what about the warrior women? Here is where the myth gets spicy. The sagas mention shield maidens, women who fought alongside men. The most famous is Logertha, made legendary by later retellings. For years, historians debated whether this was pure fiction. Then, in 2017, DNA testing changed the game. Archaeologists had long assumed that a richly armed warrior buried in Birka, Sweden, was male, but the bones, female. This doesn't prove every saga about shield maidens is true, but it does prove at least some women fought and were honored as warriors. Religion also gave women a special role. Many of the seeresses and priestesses called Volvas were women. They practiced magic, divination, and had high status in society. So Viking spirituality often put women in positions of power that went beyond the household. Now, let's not romanticize too much. Viking society was still patriarchal. Not every woman was free or powerful, many were enslaved, and their lives were brutally hard. But compared to women in Christian Europe at the same time, Norse women had more autonomy, more voice, and in some cases, more opportunities to pick up a sword and make history. So the myth of the quiet Viking housewife, not even close. Viking women were landowners, leaders, prophets, and sometimes warriors. They weren't in the background, they were woven into the center of Viking life. If you've ever played a video game or watched a fantasy movie, you know the word berserker. It conjures the image of a Viking warrior frothing at the mouth, howling like a wolf, charging naked into battle with superhuman strength, and shrugging off wounds like an action hero who forgot how mortality works. The berserker has become one of the most durable Viking myths, and like all good myths, it's built on a mix of truth and exaggeration. So who were the berserkers, really? The word comes from Old Norse berserk. Some say it means bear shirt, as in a warrior wearing a bear skin into battle. Others argue it means bear shirt, suggesting they fought without armor. Either way, these were men who set themselves apart, claiming a special, terrifying connection with animal ferocity. The sagas describe them as unstoppable, possessed by battle fury. They bit their shields, roared like animals, and terrified both enemies and allies. Some kings kept berserkers as elite guards. A sort of medieval special force is useful, but dangerous if not kept in check. So were they actually superhuman? Probably not. Modern historians suggest a few explanations. One theory is psychological. Some warriors work themselves into a frenzy through rituals, chanting, or sheer adrenaline, giving them a temporary edge in combat. Another theory is chemical. They might have used substances like fly agaric mushrooms or alcohol to enter altered states. Although the mushroom idea is debated, it's not hard to imagine a warrior using anything available to dull fear and heighten aggression. There's also the performance factor. Intimidation is half the battle. If your enemies believe you're unstoppable, you've already won. Picture a man charging at you in bearskin, screaming like he's possessed. You might think twice before holding your ground, even if he's just another mortal with a sword. Of course, the downside of being a berserker was everything else. Frenzied warriors were unpredictable. In peacetime, they were seen as dangerous, even cursed. Later sagas describe laws banning berserkers from dueling, suggesting that society eventually got tired of these walking powder kegs. The berserker myth grew with retelling. What was likely a mix of ritual, bravado, and occasional chemical help became the legend of men immune to pain, storming battlefields with the rage of gods. And that legend lives on, from heavy metal lyrics to comic books to role-playing games. Reality check. Berserkers were not superhuman, and they certainly weren't armies of shirtless hulks smashing through medieval Europe. But they did exist, and they were scary enough to leave a deep mark in the sagas and in our imagination. Another common image of the Viking Age is that all Vikings were part of one great brotherhood, united by loyalty, equality, and mead. A sort of Scandinavian fraternity where everyone was welcome at the longhouse table, as long as you brought your own drinking horn. It's a nice idea, but the reality is more complicated. Viking society was built on clans, families, and alliances. Loyalty was personal, not national. There was no Viking empire with a single leader commanding legions of raiders. Instead, there were dozens of chieftains, jarls, and petty kings, each with their own followers. Some cooperated, some fought constantly. If you think of Vikings as one big team, think again. They were more like rival startup founders, occasionally merging, more often competing. Raiding parties were organized around personal bonds. A leader with charisma and resources would gather a crew by promising loot and adventure. If you didn't like your leader, you could find another, or even start your own band. It was flexible, opportunistic, and often unstable. One bad raid, and your followers might walk away. Even within settlements, hierarchy mattered. There were wealthy landowners with big farms, poorer-free farmers, craftsmen, and traders. And then there were thrall slaves, who made up a significant portion of the population. Life as a thrall was brutal, and while some could eventually earn or buy freedom, many remained bound to their masters. So much for the myth of Viking equality. Politics was messy, too. The thing called the Thingr gathering, where free men met to make decisions, sounds democratic, and in some ways, it was. People debated, voted, and settled disputes. But not everyone had an equal voice. Wealth, reputation, and connections carried weight, just as they do in any society. The idea of all Vikings sitting around a fire, making decisions together like some egalitarian commune, doesn't quite hold up. And don't forget rivalry. Viking history is full of feuds, family vendettas, betrayals, and shifting alliances. The sagas are basically medieval soap operas. Brothers killed brothers, cousins fought cousins, and alliances broke apart over insults or inheritance disputes. So no, Vikings were not one big happy brotherhood. They were a patchwork of competing groups, bound together by necessity, ambition, and sometimes sheer survival. Their society was dynamic and flexible, but it was also fractured and brutal. Yet, in a way, that's what made them so successful. Their lack of central authority meant anyone with enough daring could rise to power. A farmer's son could become a raider, then a leader, then a king. Opportunity and danger walked hand in hand, and that energy propelled the Viking Age forward. The myth of Viking brotherhood may not be accurate, but the reality, a society built on ambition, rivalry, and restless energy, is just as fascinating. So how did the Viking Age end? Popular imagination often paints it as a dramatic defeat, armies smashing longships, crowned kings vanquishing the invaders, a glorious finale to centuries of pillaging. But history, as usual, is messier and far less cinematic. The Viking Age didn't really end with a single battle. Instead, it gradually faded over decades as Scandinavian society transformed. One factor was integration. Vikings began to settle in the lands they once raided, marrying into local families, converting to Christianity, and adopting European governance. In England, Normandy, and Ireland, former raiders became landlords, merchants, and nobles. The sword gradually gave way to negotiation, and the longship became more a tool for trade than terror. Another key factor was political centralization. The early Viking Age thrived on decentralization, countless chieftains and jarls competing for power. By the late 11th century, stronger kingdoms emerged in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Unified leadership meant fewer rogue raids, more diplomacy, and a push toward integration into European norms. The Vikings didn't vanish, they became kings, jarls, and citizens of larger states. Christianization also played a crucial role. Missionaries converted Scandinavian rulers, monasteries offered economic opportunities, and the Old Norse religion gradually receded. Violence didn't disappear overnight, but the ideological justification for a raiding weakened. Burning a monastery became less acceptable when the king and local bishop were the same person. Yet, the end of the Viking Age wasn't a complete loss of identity. Scandinavian culture retained its distinctiveness. Seafaring, lawmaking traditions, craftsmanship, and oral storytelling all continued. The sagas, the enduring myths, and the legends of explorers like Leif Erikson preserved the Viking spirit, even if the age of raiders itself was over. So the dramatic cinematic ending we imagine is partly Hollywood, partly heroic storytelling. The truth is a quieter, more strategic conclusion and evolution from raiders to rulers, from warriors to citizens, from myths to legacies. We've spent a lot of time busting myths today. Horned helmets that never existed, bloodthirsty raiders who were actually savvy traders, berserkers who were part psychology, part performance, and shield maidens who defied stereotypes. And yet, as fascinating as the real Vikings are, we also have to admit something. Myths matter. Why? Because myths inspire curiosity. They make history approachable, entertaining, and memorable. They help us connect to a past that is otherwise distant, muddy, and complicated. A myth isn't just it's a narrative that captures the imagination. Without myths, the Viking Age might be nothing more than archaeological reports and dry numbers. The best part is when we combine myths with reality. Real Vikings were complex: traders, explorers, warriors, lawmakers, and storytellers. They navigated seas, fought battles, negotiated alliances, and built societies that influenced all of Europe. When we understand the facts, the myths become even more powerful. They are the stories that grew from real deeds, exaggerated over time, and made legendary. So next time you picture a Viking with a horned helmet charging across a battlefield, remember, the image is fun, iconic, and wrong. But the real Vikings, they are infinitely more fascinating. Their lives, their societies, and their legacies continue to surprise, challenge, and inspire us. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we're still talking about them 1,000 years later, laughing at the myths and marveling at the reality. Vikings were never just one thing. They were a mix of contradictions, brutal yet cultured, pragmatic yet daring, mythic yet human. And that, in the end, is the story worth telling.